it was like, who cares about, you know, Korean culture? Like no one took it seriously. And so for a very long time, I always felt like I was kind of like the odd person out. I was like crazy for wanting to do this.
Regina, I see your work in MTV, Vanity Fair, Elle magazine, Netflix, Washington Post, Rolling Stone, and more. You're crushing it at the moment. You're writing about the Hallyu phenomenon in some of the world's biggest platforms. How does that feel?
Yeah, I mean, like usually it feels great, but sometimes, like, I know that there's so many writers out there right now who are writing about the Hallyu phenomenon. So I just feel like I'm one of many. So sometimes like it doesn't really feel all that special, but usually, yeah, like I feel the best like right after my article has been published, and like I'm like, oh yeah, it's like finally out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it competitive, like with other journalists or things like that? You said you're not the only one writing about it. I get that. And so is it kind of friendly? Is it competitive? What's the environment like?
It's really hard for me to tell. Like, I just know that like there are a lot of Korean pop culture writers out there, especially those who focus on K-pop. And then again, you know, like maybe like compared, I'm pretty sure if you compare it to like, for example, like, you know, people who write about like American film or like, you know, American music, like obviously it's still a very small number, but like compared to like, say, even like 5 years ago, I feel like there are a lot more writers who like focus on K-pop and other aspects of Korean pop culture. But it's really hard for me to like tell like how competitive it is, because like generally what I do is like when it comes to K-pop, for instance, like like usually it's like some PR agency that's, you know, working on behalf of a record label to promote, you know, some of their artists, and they'll reach out to me. And if I get like a fair number, you know, I might reach out to like some of the publications that I usually work for example, like Elle, MTV News. And I want to say that like usually when I, you know, pitch it to them, like at least one of the publications will accept my pitch when it comes to K-pop. That said, you know, in the future, like I am hoping to pitch kind of like more, you know, like Korean indie artists or even like K-pop artists that are popular in Korea, but not very popular outside of Korea. And like, so far, like I found that like editors here in the US are generally not open to accepting those kinds of pitches. At least, you know, definitely not compared to like the regular K-pop pitches. And for like K-dramas, I guess it's even like less competitive in that space in some sense, because I mean, I feel like there weren't that many people writing about K-dramas until like Squid Game came around. And like, I mean, even that article that I wrote for Elle last year, I remember like when I was writing it, I had to do like a lot of research, and like I just couldn't really find a lot of like English language articles written about the topic of K-dramas, or like the history of K-dramas. And so like I remember having to like interview a lot of Korean experts and read a lot of Korean language articles. So I want to say like right now, K-dramas is like writing about K-dramas isn't that competitive, but I think it is starting to become more and more competitive, especially after Squid Game.
Everyone had an opinion on Squid Game. And I want to get into them. You just said that you were reading like Korean language articles as well. Do you think that gives you an advantage, you know, being able to read Korean or having that sort of Korean heritage as well? Does that give you an advantage when you're doing this, Regina?
I think it does. And I say that because like, I would say probably like almost half of the editors that I've worked with decided to work with me because I am of Korean descent. And I mean, like at least a couple of them have explicitly told me that you know, the reason why they wanted me to write about a certain topic pertaining to Korean culture was because I'm Korean American, and because like I understand the culture and can read the language and can also interview people in Korean.
I think the language thing is really important. I mean, when I write, I try to base it as much as I can on the Korean language and what's happening here in Korean. Despite doing that, you know, no matter what I write, there will always be blowback. There will always be something. Have you survived with that? Because writing about K-pop, writing about Hallyu, you know, there are reputations that come with these things, and fans can be very emotionally attached, and you can put things up and people will start, you know, criticizing just because they're bored sometimes, because they want sensation. Have you survived with all this, like writing in the 21st century about such topics about which people are so passionate about?
Yeah, I mean, I've survived, I would say. I mean, that's
Yeah.
why I, you know, continue to write about these topics. But I mean, I think most of my articles haven't been that controversial. And generally, like, you know, if I don't like a particular K-drama, for instance, or I don't like a particular K-pop artist, like I'll just choose not to write about them. You know, it's as simple as that. Like, I mean, I'll probably honestly like turn down like half the requests that I get. But you know, I will say that so that Vanity Fair article that I wrote about Squid Game, so that's probably the one where like I got the most amount of blowback. You know, because I was writing about like the mixed reactions that South Koreans had about Squid Game. And, you know, it's a series that has just received like, you know, so much praise in the US. I don't think I've even seen, well, I think I have seen like maybe like one negative review of Squid Game in the US media. And that was it. And, you know, people I think were just kind of like shocked by what I wrote. Like, I think everyone just kind of like assumed that like, you know, because so many Americans loved it, like, of course, like every South Korean has to love it even more. And, you know, that wasn't the case. And like, I also got, some criticism from like Koreans, or at least like they call it, like they say that they're Korean on Twitter. So I have to kind of like believe them. And they're like saying like, oh, like this writer is portraying Koreans in a negative light. But, you know, it was all something that I could deal with. And it's something that you would expect, you know, like if you don't expect that kind of backlash from time to time, then you just can't be a journalist. And I felt like, you know, I wasn't purposely like, you know, trying to like downplay Squid Game's success or like, you know, say anything negative about it. I was really just trying to convey what a lot of South Koreans felt, because I just felt like, I mean, and like, I will say that like another reason why I actually wrote that article was because in the US, it was like there's just so many people, whether they're like, you know, American journalists or just like the American public in general, who just like made it seem like all Korean dramas were like Squid Game, or like, you know, like Squid Game was like the only K-drama out there that was, you know, really popular and worth watching. And, you know, if you like read my article to the end, like I try to like, you know, cite like examples of other K-dramas, you know, that have been popular, maybe not so much in the US, but in other parts of the globe. And it was really like kind of my way of telling people, hey, there's just like so much content out there. You know, it's not just Squid Game. Yes, like it's great that like, you know, Squid Game blew up like it did.
Right.
It definitely opened a lot of doors, but like, you know, if you're wondering why there wasn't that same level of reaction in South Korea, it's because like Koreans are just so used to watching like really high quality content.
Yeah. And a lot of them still watching the saguks and things like that over here. You know, they still dominate so much of the airwaves. Listening to you speak, Regina, it makes me imagine that people writing about K-dramas or K-pop sort of like 10 years ago, they must have felt that they were sort of shouting into the public square and nobody was listening to them. But now, you know, everyone's on this. Do you think it was the Vanity Fair one that was like the biggest one that had the reach? Did you like, have there been any of the pieces that you've wrote, and we'll go through some of them in detail, but have there been any of them where like you've gone to bed and woken up the next day and just seen that it's kind of exploded or anything?
I will say the Elle article I wrote about, you know, you can't stand K-pop and not stand against anti-Asian hate or like anti-Asian racism. That one just like really exploded. I mean, that was probably, I want to say like just based on like the reactions that I saw on social media, I felt like that one was probably the most popular article that I've written so far. But even another Elle article that I wrote, the one about like kind of like the history of K-dramas, like the K-drama renaissance. And actually, I want to say that that's probably still like the article that I'm most proud of, just because like when that was published, I want to say that like at the time, like there just wasn't really any other English language article, not scholarly paper. Like I'm not talking about, academic papers, but I'm just talking about like, like journalistic articles that people can read in like, a few minutes. I felt like my article was probably like one of the first articles in English to really cover the history and the evolution of K-dramas. And that was an article where like I still hear from different people, like like when people just reach out to me even to this day, just telling me that like, oh, like they just came across my article and felt like they learned so much about K-dramas. And so it didn't like explode like in a week or anything, but like I would say it's definitely one of my articles where like I've been getting like a steady stream of positive remarks.
That's a great thing, and knowing that your work is always there. And I think that's one of the reasons, Regina, why I got in touch with you, because I use some of your articles for my Korean studies classes, because sometimes the students,
I'm so flattered.
but sometimes the students, like you said, they don't want to read these long scholarly articles. They want an overview that's easily digestible, accessible. It has some colorful pictures and looks 21st century, which, your work does. So it's great, and of course it will all be linked below. Do you read any of the scholarly articles? Do you ever sort of venture into them and try to, or that's a different ball game for you?
I mean, I occasionally do, yes. And like for that particular Elle article where I talked about the history of K-dramas, I believe I do cite, or like I believe I do like include links to some scholarly articles. For example, like the section where I talked about like Latin America, like how K-dramas like blew up in Latin America, like, how that happened. And there wasn't much research about that. And like, I didn't want to just like lean on this one interview that I had with one of my, like one of the experts that I'm friends with. And so I just like did some Googling, and like eventually I came across this like really like wonderful article that also like cited other scholarly papers. Like, oh, wow, okay. And it was in English, which is great because like, I don't read Spanish. So yeah, like I do like, I do for every one of my articles, like whenever I feel like something requires like some research, then, I will go out and do it. And like, if that's a scholarly article that I have to go through, then I will.
Yeah, I'm sure there's loads of professors and academics out there going, I've been writing about this for years. And it is all there, but it's great that you do it. When I look at your website, and see your great collection of writing and all the topics that you cover. Now, and this is definitely not a criticism. I want to be clear about this, Regina, but looking at the collection of your published work over time, and they go back to like 2016, there's a bit of a gap, and then the resurgence in 2020. Do you think your topics and themes are becoming more mainstream? So like when you start out, you're writing about Lee Jun-ik 감독님, history of philosophy, Korean film, art exhibitions, Han, and now when we look at them, it's K-pop, it's K-dramas primarily. Is this a natural evolution? Is it possible to bring some of those earlier elements to the mainstream publications? Or what's your perception on how the themes and what you're writing about has changed over time in relation to Korean culture and content?
Yeah. So the funny thing is, like, I actually, like, from the very beginning, like, I wanted to write about K-dramas and K-pop.
Okay. Right.
But back in, like, say, like, 2011, 2012, which is, like, when I kind of, like, started writing about it, like, back then, like, there just weren't that many opportunities, at least in the US, to really write about those topics in English. And so really like the only opportunity that I could find at the time was writing part-time for the Korean Cultural Service, which is now known as the Korean Cultural Center in New York. They're a branch of the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism of Korea. And And that was like, you know, right around like when I moved to New York, and I was like, you know, hoping to kind of like pursue this passion of mine to like somehow promote Korean culture. And again, like there just weren't really any opportunities back then. Like people didn't really, at least people in the US, like didn't really care about K-pop. They didn't know what K-dramas were. And so like the next best thing was to write about like events and like art exhibitions that were held at the Korean Cultural Service, which is like this like really like small I mean, yeah, like you know, it's like it's an office space, right? And they also have like a gallery space. Yeah. But I was like, I remember like at the time I was like super grateful for the opportunity, because like that was really like one of like very few places in at the time like in New York City that like showcased you know, like Korean artists and like Korean cultural events on a regular basis. And so I was hired as like a part-time reporter for them for about 6 months. And that's why, like, you know, you see my articles on like art exhibitions and kind of like, I guess, more like niche areas. And I mean, I really enjoyed writing about them. And that's what, like, I would say, like, that was like one of my favorite jobs I've ever had, even though it was like one of my lowest paying ones.
Often goes that way, yeah.
Yeah. And so after that, yeah, and that was just like for a term of like 6 months, and then I was also like transitioning to like a more intense full-time job. And again, like I was constantly like trying to find opportunities to like write about Korean culture, and I just couldn't really find them at the time. I mean, I guess like they didn't exist, or maybe like I just was really bad at like finding them. I don't know. So I took on like a series of like full-time jobs. Some of them were like kind of adjacent to promoting Korean culture. But, you know, because they were all like full-time jobs, like I didn't really have time to like, you know, continue my writing on the side. But like, I think the few articles that I wrote in like 2016 was actually like in between jobs. So that's how I was able to like, you know, write about like director Lee Jun-ik, who was absolutely wonderful. Like, I mean, that was, I want to say like one of my favorite interviews ever, because like he's such a sweet and humble person. And like, he was just like able to like explain everything like so well. I mean, like somehow like the whole interview was conducted in Korean. And like, I was thinking like, oh my gosh, like, you know, I barely know like at the time, you know, I was like, I barely know like, you know, like film related terms in English. Like, what if he uses like all this film jargon? And like, he didn't, like, he just like explained everything so clearly. And so yeah, anyway, that was like one of my favorite interviews. And then like after after 2016 ish, like again, like I just continued like working full-time jobs. And the reason why you don't really like see me writing anything until like 2020-ish was because there was like a period of time where like one of my full-time jobs basically did not allow me to write anything outside of the organization. Wow. So yeah, I know, like they were just really strict with me for some reason. So after I left was like when I was able to finally like start writing about Korean culture again. And to be quite honest, like it really happened like thanks to the pandemic, thanks to like, you know, the fact that like I was able to work from home, because like, you know, I didn't have to commute to the office all the time. And so like I could just use those hours that I would normally use to commute to and from the office to just write. So
your output since then has been pretty prolific, you know, and seeing it across all these different mediums, it must be quite interesting to think that you're not allowed to write outside of your job, and then all of a sudden where you are, just, here comes the release. Moving into some of the things that you have been writing about, and perhaps we'll start, Regina, with Korean dramas. Now, you know, when I teach Hallyu and when I have to talk and write about them in my lectures and in the press, it means I have to know them to some degree. Right? So I can't talk about these things without first having watched them. So like, watching the dramas these days can be quite a commitment. So like you're talking at least like if a binged weekend or a whole day, if they're 12 episodes, 1 hour. Do you have to watch a lot of like K-dramas and things for work? How do you manage it? Do you watch them in fast forward? Do you just pretend you've watched it and just go onto YouTube and watch clips? Like, it's a time commitment, isn't it? This is what I'm asking. Yeah. So how do you manage that, and what do you do?
Oh, that's a great question. So I started working full time for Netflix as one of their writers. I write articles for To Doom. It's spelled Tudum as in Mary, like To Doom, and that's supposed to be the sound that you hear Netflix make when you log into Netflix, like To Doom, right?
I was wondering what the hell that meant, and that's it. Okay.
Yeah. It's pronounced To Doom, and they just launched the site in December.
Yeah.
And if you go to like netflix.com/todoom, like you'll see a whole bunch of articles and videos about like some of the most popular shows on Netflix. So that's what I'm doing full time at the moment. And yes, like since my focus is on K-dramas and Korean films, I actually do spend most of my time these days watching K-dramas. And you're right, it is a huge time commitment because as you know, like, you know, most K-dramas are like 16 plus episodes. I mean, there are some now that are like about like 8 to 10 episodes. But yeah, most of them are still like around 16 episodes. Whereas like, I mean, a lot of these American shows that you see on Netflix are like, what, 8 episodes, if even that. So yeah, I mean, you know, I try to like, I mean, I wish I could fast forward more often, but like I found that at least with K-dramas, it's if you fast forward, especially for like thrillers or like, you know, K-dramas. Like I recently wrote an article for To Doom that recommended like some of the top K-dramas, top crime dramas on Netflix. And, you know, if you just like fast forward, even like for like a couple of minutes, like you miss what's going on. Right. You have to like pay attention the whole time. And so like when I was writing that article about like the top 7 Korean crime dramas on Netflix, I literally had to like watch every single one of them. Although like, you know, it helped that like I had already seen 2 of them, like Stranger and Voice. And so like I basically just had to kind of like, you know, read some recaps and like jog my memory. But like the other ones, like I had to spend like, I had to spend like most of my working hours like watching every single episode from beginning to end.
It's a dream job though, isn't it? I mean, some of my students, when I asked them, like, they said, David, what they want sangdam or counseling, what shall I do for my job? And so I asked them, what do you like doing? And they're like, I like watching dramas on Netflix. There is a job out there for these people. I'm sure it's pretty difficult to get, but you're living the dream. Did you?
That's what a lot of people say, but I have to say that like when you're in that environment, you know, and I see like my colleagues who are like, you know, watching like 2 or 3 American TV shows in like within 1 or 2 days, and I'm like, I'm still on like the 13th episode of this K-drama, you know.
That must be, it must be hard to, you kind of force yourself. Did you, recently I watched The Silent Sea. That's on Netflix, isn't it? Did you watch that one?
Yes.
What did you think?
I loved it. I thought it was like very well crafted, especially considering that like, you know, it was like really like South Korea's like first like, I guess like mystery series set in space.
Yeah.
So considering that, like, you know, I don't know, maybe like, I don't know if it's because like part of me kind of had like low expectations, but like when I saw it, like it really blew my mind. I thought, you know, the acting was superb, and like the whole like, you know, concept around like lunar water I thought was interesting. But I know that like that show for some reason just received a lot of negative reviews in Western media. And I think like part of it is because a lot of critics didn't really seem to understand what happened, like what actually happened in the series. And like, it also makes me question, like, did they fast forward as well? You know, like, did they actually like watch like every episode, or did they just kind of like skim through it and like, you know, watch the trailer or something? Because I felt like I came across some reviews that were just like, you know, not fully accurate. Sure. And also like a lot of them compared The Silent Sea with Squid Game. And I'm just like, there's like no similarity except like they were both, you know, produced in Korea. They're both like K-dramas, but like that's it. But it's almost like, you know, ever since Squid Game came out, it definitely feels as if like every subsequent, you know, K-drama is being compared to Squid Game.
Well, I think that's one of the things that I want to get into next, how we define K-dramas, because Silent Sea and Squid Game and Kingdom, whatever, they're all completely different, but then they're put into this umbrella term. But just with The Silent Sea, because I sat and watched it, And I thought it was interesting. I mean, if you see it in the Western context, you might be comparing it, I don't know, to Interstellar or The Martian or something like that, right? And then you might be disappointed. But I think if you see it in a Korean context and you understand, it's kind of like one of the first sci-fi things that they've done. I know there are more, but it's one of the really big first kind of space futuristic things that are being done, which hasn't traditionally happened here. And also you get the female characters are the ones that survive. Like, I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah.
That was interesting. And there's no love in it. There's no romance. There's not even, you know, this kind of, you know, home or anything like that. But it's just, there's no love. There's no romance. All the women survive. And I was like, that's really kind of interesting in a Korean context. So I thought it was good for that. The acting, of course, was great as well.
Yeah. And I think you like, we are seeing like, you know, more and more K-dramas that feature like strong female characters that have like less or like even no romance. And I again, like, I don't know like how many of these like English language reviews actually picked up on that.
Exactly.
So,
I saw that.
So yeah, thank you for like, you know, mentioning all of that.
I saw that Slavoj Žižek, the philosopher, he reviewed the new Matrix movie without watching it.
Oh my gosh.
That's postmodernism now. Yeah, that's what people do.
No.
Don't do that, please. Let's get into this definition of K-dramas then, because this is a really interesting thing that, you know, there is this huge difference in theme, in genre, in style, but they're all kind of lumped together as K-dramas, even on streaming platforms like Netflix or in articles. And it's not a criticism, just an observation. In your piece for Elle magazine on the K-drama renaissance, you took a couple of paragraphs, Regina, to try to explain and define what these K-dramas are. They're soap operas, they're single season, they're high production, they're middle class, they're Korean, but they're universal at the same times. It's hard, similar to K-pop actually. It's kind of hard to define what a K-drama is sometimes. So what's your take on this, Regina? How do we define K-dramas? Is it an appropriate term? Do we need to have like subgenres and things like that? Or what's your take on it, Regina?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, you know, I simply think of K-dramas, and I think I wrote this in my Elle article. I just think of K-dramas simply as scripted Korean shows. I mean, I used to say TV shows, but like now, since like so many of them are on streaming platforms like Netflix, like I would just call them like shows or series, like scripted series. And you know, as far as I can remember, like that's the way that K-dramas have always been defined as. And you know, it's just like, I just feel like that term has been like so ingrained and like just used like throughout the decades that like, you know, anyone who's like, you know, watched K-dramas will just call them like, you know, K-dramas. And people just understand it. Like there are definitely like, you know, different kinds of K-dramas, especially nowadays where you have like, you know, crime dramas, you have like thrillers, horror, right? It's not just like romance or like sageuk anymore. So I feel like because that definition has already like kind of been set a long time ago, like I just, at least me personally, like I just think of like K-dramas as like the all-encompassing term for scripted Korean shows.
Yeah.
But I mean, like you bring up a great point, and you know, in the future, like I mean, obviously, like Korea is going to continue making like a huge variety of K-dramas, right? When it comes to like genres, and so like, should we create like a term to describe some of these subgenres? Like, yeah, I mean, I think you know, that's a reasonable ask, but is that going to happen? Like, I'm not really sure. And I have to say that, like, you know, part of me kind of just wants to continue using this term like K-dramas, because like, even though like K-dramas have recently become like popular all over the world. I mean, I should say, okay, like I know they have been popular in many other parts of the globe for a very long time, but like I'm thinking like, especially in the West, like especially in the US, like Squid Game was definitely like the turning point, right? And so because I feel like K-dramas have like really taken off in the US like fairly recently, like I kind of want to continue using that term, because like I still see a lot of people, including some editors, who are not really familiar with the term. And it's like when they hear anything with drama in it, you know, they think of it as like, oh, it's like the opposite of comedy. It's like something like, you know, super serious. Like they think of it like, you know, in those terms, like the kind of the traditional Hollywood terms, right? And I remember like when I was like writing one of my articles, and like the copy editor just like kept like crossing out like K-drama and like just replacing it with like another term, right? And I'm like, well, no, this is the whole point. Like these are called K-dramas. So like I think, again, like there are many Americans who are not quite sure what K-dramas actually mean. Yeah.
It definitely works for branding. So I think even if it's not that accurate, because you have, for example, you might have Hometown Cha-Cha-Cha next to something like Squid Game or Sweet Home, and they're all completely different. And my mother would watch Hometown Cha-Cha-Cha, and she did, and she loved it. But then if Squid Game comes on next, she's like, well, David, this is a bit violent, and you know, it's completely different. But so it doesn't do a good job, I don't think, of defining and categorizing them like we like to do in the modern world, but it does work for branding and image and awareness outside of Korea, doesn't it? I mean, it helps. Yeah. Because a K-drama can be anything then.
Yeah. And I mean, like, you know, in that case, like, for example, like if we're talking about Squid Game, like, yes, it's a K-drama, but like, you know, in the same article, like I would describe it as like a Korean survival thriller or something like that. Right. So, I mean, you can always use these other terms to like further describe the K-drama. But I think, at least for now, like I'd still like to see people continue to use K-drama as like the all-encompassing term.
Yeah.
You're right, like for branding purposes.
Especially, I think, in the international media. Sometimes, maybe not as common anymore these days, but it used to kind of be in the Korean language like 주말 drama and 평일 drama, like the weekend dramas, the weekday dramas. They would define them by not so much theme, but like when they would come on screen. I thought that was really kind of novel way. You mentioned, Regina, these dramas becoming more popular in the West. You know, like you can go back in Asia to Winter Sonata and all these dramas that have been hugely popular here and in this region, but now they're going everywhere. You touch on this in your piece, Elle, but Squid Game was a truly global phenomenon. Like that seemed to transcend class and race and gender and everything. Everybody was watching that. It was a bit like Psy's Gangnam Style in that sense, I think. It was just that big, right? But if we get into...
I would say it's more like BTS. I mean, no offense to Psy, but...
He's still... Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that works for me.
But you, I mean, you're right too, because like that was really like the first time that like a Korean drama just like blew up like on every continent, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's kind of it's an exception sometimes. It's like that. But if we take a normal K-drama, and there are huge fans of K-dramas, you can find the websites, the translations that they all get into. Who do you think, and it's not monolith, but if we talk about who's normally watching K-dramas, like the regular K-dramas, so if we put sort of Squid Game in a category all on itself because it's so big, but if we take the rest of all the other K-dramas there, who do you think the demographic, do they point to a particular demographic? Are there certain people that are drawn to K-dramas? You mentioned a little bit the people in Latin America for this similarity to novellas. Who are the fans? Apart from me and you, obviously.
Are you, when you say like regular K-dramas, I mean, are you talking about like rom-coms or sageuk or like all of them?
Yeah, you can break them down if you want into different ones, but like they are becoming more popular, and I'm just trying to ascertain who's watching them. That's what I'm trying to get at now. Yeah,
like, so what I can say is, so I actually used to work for Drama Fever. I worked for them for a couple of years, and for those who may not be aware, like Drama Fever was this like very I would say like very popular like video streaming website that focused on showing Asian TV shows, especially Korean dramas. Like Korean dramas were like really popular on that website, and like I say popular because there was definitely a sizable like subscriber base we had a lot of viewers who were based in the US, but also in other parts of the world. And so for, I would say, a rather like niche video streaming platform, like at the time, it was like really successful. And of course, you know, you also have Viki, which is, you know, still like doing very well today. But when I was working for Drama Fever, I remember like, and this was like in like the 2010s, like 2011 to like 12-ish or so. And we found that like many of our subscribers that were based in the US were actually like women who were like Black, Hispanic, or Latina, and white. I mean, we obviously like had a lot of like Asian American viewers as well. But like, if I remember correctly, like most of the subscribers were like female, and they were like, you know, white, Black, or Hispanic / Latina. So like I remember thinking like, oh, that's like very interesting. Like, you know, I didn't think that like at the time, like I wasn't sure if these K-dramas would be so appealing to like non-Asians, but apparently they were. And then I remember like last year when I was interviewing different people for my Elle article about the history of K-dramas, I actually like joined quite a few Facebook groups. Facebook groups of like K-drama fans, and like there's this like one K-drama Facebook group that's mostly composed of people like K-drama fans are based in the US. And I have to say, I mean, this group has like thousands of members, and I mean, you know, like I don't know exactly like what the demographics are, but like I feel like it's about like, you know, roughly like you definitely see a lot of men. You also see women. But they're of all ages. You see like, you know, men in their like 50s and 60s who are enjoying K-dramas. You also see like, you know, women who are like older who are also watching K-dramas. And of course you also see like, so I feel like now like there's such a wide range that like it's really hard to say like exactly like, you know, who these K-drama fans are, because I really do feel like, especially in recent years, and especially like, you know, due to the pandemic, because like as you're probably aware, like I mean, like during like from like even just on Netflix, there's like a public statistic out there saying that between 2019 and 2021, US viewership of K-dramas increased by over 200%.
Wow.
Yeah, like over 200%. And that's just in the US. And so like, you know, you definitely see that like now I just feel like, you know, both men and women are watching K-dramas, and you see people of all ages from like, you know, like tweens and teens to like people who are like, you know, 60 or above.
There's when you just talked about the jump on Netflix of 200%, which is phenomenal, and I think there's a lot of crossover effects there with Gisenjung or Parasite and BTS, Blackpink. You know, it must all join together. And this is showing my ignorance here, I'm not sure if you can, but Netflix is different in different countries. Like if I turn on Netflix in Korea, there'll be different content from somebody in a different country. Is there a Korea in America, is there a Korean drama like category, like a K-drama category? But then my question would also be like, is there a Japanese drama category and a Chinese drama category, or do they all come up, or do you search for them, or how does that work?
It really depends on the Netflix algorithm. I mean, Netflix, has its own algorithm. Like, I honestly don't know how it works, but like, I mean, it basically like, it's based on what you watched. Like, it's based on what you've watched in the past. And so like, chances are like when I log into Netflix, I will like the categories, many of the categories that I see in my Netflix account will be different from yours.
Right.
And I like personally, like, you know, I've seen a category that says like, you know, made in Korea and like, you know, East Asian TV shows or something like that. But I see like a whole bunch of other, you know, like categories. So it just really depends. Like, I don't know like how many of these like tags exist, but again, it's just like very much tailored to your viewing habits.
That's really interesting that even some of the tags might be very different, right? I sometimes check with my young nephew because we share with Netflix, we share a Netflix thing. And if I go into his one, I can see all the stuff that he's watching, like all these kind of fantasy and all that kind of very, very different. It's interesting how that works with Netflix.
And like, I want to say, if I can just like add one more thing. Like, I mean, that's also, you know, one of the reasons, like, you know, why I think like people started watching so many K-dramas during the pandemic was because like they just happened to like stumble across like a K-drama. And, you know, after they finish watching that K-drama, Netflix will recommend like other K-dramas. And when I interviewed people for my Elle article, although unfortunately, like the editors had to like cut out like all the quotes from my interviews because like my article was like already really long. But like I remember like many of them saying, like many of the people that I interviewed said that you know, they just kind of like fell down a rabbit hole. Like they, like once they watched the K-drama, like Netflix just kept recommending another one and another one. And like now, I mean, some of them actually said that like now like all they watch is K-dramas. Like quite a few of them actually told me that they don't really watch American TV shows anymore. So
I've noticed that, and that it's, the effect has been real, because I speak to people back in the United Kingdom, in England, and they'll tell me that they've watched those K-dramas. So it's not just all, you know, media hype and fake news press and things like that, but there's genuine, which can happen, right? Let's be real about it, but it's genuine and people are watching it.
Yeah. Oh, and sorry, and can I like add one more statistic?
Go on.
So like, you know, roughly in that same time period, like between 2019 and 2021, like during the pandemic, you know, I read that like global viewership of K-dramas on Netflix actually increased 6-fold.
Wow.
So if you think the statistic for, like US viewership is high, like, I mean, across the globe, like, you know, people like global viewership increased by like 600%. So it's a lot.
That I can definitely believe, because when I teach the international students, the students, let's just say from Vietnam, from Hong Kong, from Thailand, from India, their knowledge of K-dramas and things like that is off the charts. You know, very passionate, very into it, and definitely to be acknowledged and respected. If we stay on this Netflix thing, and again, you know, just feel free to say if you can't answer these questions or anything, but while we're here, how much of the success is because of the content and the quality of the Korean dramas, and how much is because it's on Netflix? So it's obviously both of these factors are working together, and it's going to be really hard to put a percentage on it, right? But I'm just trying to wonder, you know, could these have succeeded? Could these dramas, could these things, could they have succeeded on their own? Or is Netflix the driving force? And Netflix could also be the driving force between dramas from other countries. Do you see what I mean? I'm trying to ask, is it, you know, how do these two things interact? Is there a particular one that's pushing it? The actual quality of the content itself, or the accessibility to Netflix that the whole world has now? What's going on there, Regina?
Well, first of all, like, you know, disclaimer, like, even though I work for Netflix, like I can't speak on behalf of Netflix. And so like what I'm about to say is just my personal opinion. But yeah, it's definitely both. I mean, let's take Squid Game for example. If Squid Game had not been on Netflix, like, would it have received the amount of attention that it got? Honestly, no. I don't think so. I really don't think so. Because like, on what other platform could, you know, like what other platform is, I would say, like as ubiquitous as Netflix is? Like, where else could you really watch a Korean show like Squid Game almost anywhere in the world, you know? And because, and again, like, you know, Netflix, because, you know, once you log into Netflix, if there's a particular show that just got released and Netflix wants to push it in that market, you know, it's like the first thing you see when you log in, right?
After the Tudum.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, like I think Netflix definitely, you know, played and is still playing a huge role. And, you know, we're also seeing like content from, like, you know, other countries, I think, that are also becoming popular on Netflix. I mean, obviously you had, you know, like Money Heist, right?
Yep.
That was also popular on Netflix. So yeah, like I do think that, like, Netflix is playing a huge role in, I guess, kind of like the globalization of content from you know, countries outside of the West.
Sure.
Or yeah, outside of the US, I should say.
I watched Dark, which is a German drama on Netflix, and there was no way I would find a German drama, but I watched Dark. It was this kind of weird mind-bending time travel thing. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but
it's on my watch list. I need to get through all my K-dramas first, The Witcher.
it's
I
taken
still
me.
have not seen The Witcher. Like, oh my gosh, I'm like the only person at Netflix who has not seen The Witcher yet. I'm like, it's because I have to like make it through all these 16 episode K dramas.
It's hard. I watched season 1 of The Witcher, and the theme tune, the song, stuck in my head so much. My this is off topic, but my brother-in-law at the moment, he's Korean. He's watching Game of Thrones for the first time, and as he's watching it, he's asking me, like in Korean, but he's asking me, David, is this this is in England, right, or this is Scotland? And he's trying to map it out as if it's real geography and real places, and I'm working really hard to say, no, this is fantasy. There's no dragons in England. Young Lim.
Oh, that's so cute.
One of the advantages, I think, of Netflix is that the accessibility, as you've said, and it's there, and then you can go down the rabbit hole. There's algorithms. We also see this on YouTube and things like that. Again, you can't speak for Netflix, absolutely, but there's loads of advantages. Just on the flip side, quickly, is it possible that there might be some disadvantages? So by what I mean is that, could it happen that the Korean dramas might lose what made them Korean? For example, generally they might be one season, they might be kind of romantic or saccharine, not always, but as they become more catered for international tastes, is it possible that that international success could change them in some way, and that some way might be they might lose some of the things that made them so appealing in the first place? Did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and again, like, I'm not speaking on behalf of Netflix, but I feel like lately, like, we've seen a much more diverse, like more diverse forms of storytelling coming out of South Korea. And I want to say, it's partly due to platforms like Netflix. And I know, I mean, this is like information that's like out there, so it's not like confidential or anything, but like I mean, various Korean creators have said that, like, working with Netflix has afforded them lots of creative freedom to like kind of bring their vision to a K-drama and to really like shape the K-drama the way they want to. And so I think that's one of the reasons why what we've seen shows like Squid Game and Hellbound that like you just couldn't imagine seeing coming out of Korea like even a few years ago. But at the same time, you still have lots of rom-coms and like saguks that are still being produced. Personally, like I'm a fan of crime dramas, and I know that's like another trend that we've been seeing in K-dramas in recent years. And so like I think it's great that we're just like seeing like much more diverse forms of storytelling coming out of South Korea.
I think that's definitely true, and especially using the webtoons as the content. But yeah, it gives much more freedom to explore these, whether they're in terms of horror or sex or violence. Absolutely.
And I'll just say one more thing about Squid Game. Like, yes, like it's, very different from a lot of the other K-dramas that we've seen so far. And, I guess people could argue that it's not very Korean in some ways. But at the same time, I feel like, I mean, come on, it's like the games that they play are all like Korean children's games, right? So it's Korean in that sense. Also, the kind of like storytelling that you see, like based on like director Hwang's like vision for the drama, right? Like, for example, the Marbles episode where like people are crying, it's like super emotional. Like a lot of American audiences felt that was very fresh and original. Whereas like I know like a lot of Korean audiences are like, oh, it's too melodramatic, it's total shinpa. But like that I would say is like very Korean. Like that particular episode would not have been told in the same way had it not been a Korean drama. And I think people appreciated that.
Absolutely. Because there's all those face-ups, there's all those close-ups of faces.
Right.
There's that emotion. That's what I always get with Korean dramas. There's just these long, lingering shots of people's faces, and you're meant to sort of, I don't know, infer the mood or the emotions. And you don't really often see that elsewhere. You actually, Regina, you actually interviewed director Hwang Dong-hyuk from Squid Game, which is a pretty cool thing. He's probably one of the hottest people in the world last year for what he did. And what I noticed, or what I was thinking about that reading your interview with him and your article on him, is that Squid Game was the creation of an individual with a vision, like with the writing, the directing, the characters, that marble episode that you've just touched on. So it wasn't made something by committee, but it was like the vision of an auteur, like you get with Bongjuno Gamdoknim or something like that. And did you see it that way? So it seemed to me like this was an individual that had this idea, and Netflix allowed them to make it as they wanted, rather than this kind of by committee or executive decision thing.
Yeah, like, I mean, yeah, like I definitely agree. And like, again, like if we're talking about Squid Game in particular, you know, it was like written and directed by Hwang Dong-hyuk. So it really was his vision. And like, I remember in my email interview with him, like you could very much tell that like he was really like leading the direction of the entire show, like throughout, and just really guiding like all the actors on what, you know, what to do. So yeah, like I think if, you know, if you have any kind of show that's really led by like, you know, one or, you know, two people, then, you know, chances are that there'll be like fewer compromises, right? And the storytelling will be tighter as a result. And again, you know, like if you're giving this director like a lot of creative freedom, right, to realize his vision on screen, then chances are like it'll feel more authentic as well. So yeah, I definitely agree with you.
Big fan of that authenticity and individual visions. We might not always like them, but I like, you know, seeing people do that thing, right? We want that.
Yeah.
I perhaps want to move on from dramas to K-pop in a minute, but before we do, are there any dramas that you think people might be sleeping on that we haven't touched on, or that you have thought were particularly good or not good? Is there anything we've missed? I know, for example, I've recently spoken about in the media, Snowdrop has been a huge controversy over here, and then the Woman with the Red Sleeve has been big popular historical drama. Are there any ones that you've seen or that you're looking forward to, perhaps, that we might not have covered?
Well, I mean, all of us, so I guess like by the time, I don't know what's going to happen by the time this episode airs, but like All of Us Are Dead just dropped on Netflix today. It's Friday, January 28th, my time. But anyway, like I have a feeling that one is going to be a huge hit. I hope it will be a huge hit. Like I saw the screeners for it and like I thought it was fantastic. But again, like, you know, like I said before, like I'm a huge fan of crime dramas. And I mean, I know that like what I'm about to mention was like popular in Korea, but like I do wish that like these dramas received more traction like outside of Korea and like especially in the US. But like I will say like Stranger, for example, with Bae-duna, right, and Cho Seung-woo, like that is still like, you know, one of my favorite K-dramas of all time. Voice was also good. I mean, heck, it was like renewed for 4 seasons in Korea, right? Although like only the first 2 seasons are available on Netflix, but like I really liked that crime drama as well. So yeah, those are my top 2. Like, oh, and Chief of Staff, like the political drama, I really loved that one. Yeah,
I love the first season.
I'm pretty sure like most of your listeners in Korea have like seen all these, but
yeah. I really loved the first season of Bojagwan, that Chief of Staff. Shin Min-ah, that was incredible, and Bae-duna's acting that you mentioned earlier, she's so good. Just tell me very quickly that the Netflix one that's dropping, I've already forgot. I'm sorry. When We're Dead, We're Already Dead.
All of Us Are Dead.
All of Us Are Dead. Can you tell me anything about it? I'm a bit behind the times. Like, it's a zombie thing, right? But
yeah, I mean, they're describing it as like a teenage like coming of age drama. It's a zombie thriller. And I like, it's really hard to talk about it without like revealing spoilers.
Okay.
But I mean, I will say like, I will just say that like, I'm actually not a horror fan at all. Like I try to avoid horror as much as possible. And so I was actually not even planning on watching this. But because like, you know, this is like supposed to be like a huge K-drama that Netflix is dropping, like, and I write about K-dramas, like someone had to write about it or write articles related to it. So I was like, okay, I'll watch it. And I did. And like, I actually watched it through to the end. I mean, I had to watch it with my mom, to be honest, because like it was scary.
Yeah.
But like the acting, I mean, most of the characters on the show are like, you know, they're high school students, like they're very young, but like it's just amazing how you know how good the acting is in general, I thought. And then like the zombie actors did such a great job. Like for some reason, like I feel like Koreans are so great at like creating like realistic zombies on screen, like really scary, you know, like realistic zombies, like the way they move and the way they run and chase you, like it feels like, you know, it feels very realistic. So I really enjoyed it. And then of course, like the whole like emotional storytelling, like that was definitely a huge factor as well. And I think that when people watch the drama, they will see that like the whole like emotional aspect of the drama is one of the things that really sets it apart from, say, like Hollywood zombie thrillers.
I wonder soon there'll probably be a Netflix category like Korean zombie things, because you've already got Train to Busan, you've got Kingdom, you've got Sweet Home. They do.
Although I don't think Train to Busan is available on Netflix. At least it's not in the US. But yeah.
Okay.
But yes, like Kingdom is on Netflix, and yeah, and Alive as well.
And you can read about them on Tudum. I'm just going to keep hearing that now. Let's move on to, if we can, K-pop, because that's another thing that you've spent a lot of time writing about, Regina. I only started hearing K-pop in about 2005, so I have that amount of experience. I think the first K-pop song I started listening to was like Hannah's Luxury, which was big over here at the time. Did you listen to a lot of K-pop growing up? Were you a fan of particular any groups or idols? Did you have any posters on your wall, or were you listening to other things? What's your personal, before we talk about like bands and things today you're writing, what's your personal relationship to K-pop, if you have one at all?
I think I started listening to K-pop in like 2003 or so, when I started college. Oh great, like I'm dating myself. But that's when I started listening to K-pop. And I remember like some of the first K-pop artists I listened to were like BoA, Pinkle. I really liked Pinkle. Fly to the Sky. Oh my gosh, like they're still like one of my favorite like K-pop artists of all time. Fly to the Sky. But like I didn't really have like posters or anything. Like I think the only like artists that I've ever had posters up on the wall of were the Backstreet Boys. But that's also because like I was like in middle and high school then, and you know that's when you're going through that phase. But like again, like I didn't start listening to K-pop until I was in college, and so
Why?
No posters.
You weren't alone in having Backstreet Boys posters, I think, Regina. I think a lot of the world did at the time. They were huge, weren't they? Why so late? Why did you not in middle school and high school? Why did you get into it in college? Was there a reason for that? Was it about accessibility? Was it about interest? Was it just...
I want to say actually like it started with K-dramas, because like I started watching K-dramas when I was in high school. Like I think I was like either in my junior or senior year of high school. And All About Eve was like one of the first K-dramas I saw. It's actually still one of my favorite K-dramas. Like I forgot to mention that one. Like I know it's a very old K-drama, so I don't even know if people can still watch it anymore. But if you can, like definitely watch it. But that's how I first got introduced to K-pop, because like Pinkle is on their soundtrack. And I was like, oh my gosh, I really love this song. And so I guess it had to have been my senior year of high school, because like when I went to college, like you know, I remember like, you know, researching like Pinkle, and then I found out about BoA, and it just went from there.
The crossover effect is real then. And it's amazing, like you say, Fly to the Sky and All About It. Like the things that we get into when we're young, that they last, right? And so people that are getting into the K content, whether it's dramas or movies, music today, that's going to be the stuff that lasts for them. You know, it's like that first cut is the deepest. For your top K-pop song of 2021, I was reading, you wrote about this and put it up, and there was a 54 song list and you only chose one, and there was, I guess, lots of other people doing it. So you were kind of limited in what you could choose, maybe, right? To avoid clashing with other people. But on that, the top K-pop song of 2021, you wrote, Regina, about Midnight by Chancellor, featuring Gecko. And I hadn't heard of this song until you recommended it on that list. So it's definitely got that retro synthwave sound, which is really hot. And it's got that French house, the vocoder, reminds me of Daft Punk. Why this K-pop track? And considering it has just over 100,000 views, which is not to be sniffed at, but compared to the hundreds of millions elsewhere, why are people sleeping on this track, and why did you choose it?
Yeah, I chose it because, I mean, to be quite honest, like, so like I have, multiple people from like PR firms and like record labels that I, keep in touch with, right? Like, and occasionally they will like send me emails like asking me like, oh, like, are you willing to write about, this K-pop artist? And so one of the folks that I've been keeping in touch with is a record exec at Warner Music Korea. And, he was the one who actually told me about Chancellor and his single Midnight. I was like, oh, like, honestly, like, if I were to be completely honest, like, I didn't even know about Chancellor. Like, I didn't know who he was. I hate to admit it. And so when I checked out his music video, I was like, oh my gosh, like, this song is amazing. And like the music video had all these like, K-pop icons that I was familiar with, like Taeyeon and Hyunjin from Shinhwa and Hwang Kim. I was like, oh my gosh, like, this is so cool. Like, it was like flashback for me. And, it's just a very catchy song. And I too was shocked that like, compared to a lot of other like K-pop artists' music videos, like the music video didn't have as many views. And I was like, oh my goodness, like people are missing out. And so like, I thought, by including this song that like, maybe I'll get, more people to watch the music video and listen to the song. And I had actually made a promise with that Warner Music exec. I was like, I told him, I was like, oh, like I love Chancellor and his new song Midnight. I definitely want to write about it. I will write about it. And so like I felt like I had to keep that promise. But yeah, like I will say that like that like I thought that was still like one of the best K-pop songs I heard last year.
It's a good track. It's a decent video as well. Yeah. I was quite surprised. I was surprised by the difference between the quality of the product and the amount of attention it had got. I think that's what, because when I normally, that's still really surprising to me. And I've always been a bit like weirded out by the fact that I'll look at the newspapers in Korea and they'll say like, this week, Blackpink song has now 1.2 billion views. And then 2 weeks later, it'll be now that it has 1.3 billion views. And it's like the views themselves are the news, not the music, not the video, but the news itself is that number. And, that number can be that a lot of that number is genuine. A lot of that number is like repeated plays and streaming parties and things. But that difference between views and quality was really surprising to me on that one.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, part of it, well, I can't really speak for Koreans or, people who are in Korea right now because I'm not there. But like what I can say for the US, at least, like based on my observations, is that generally speaking, like it's usually like the K-pop idol groups that tend to do well in the US. Groups of like 4 or sometimes even like 7 or 11 members. Like you just need like multiple K-pop artists in one group, and like those kinds of like K-pop idols tend to do much better than like the solo artists for some reason.
Why is that? Because like here IU is huge, Park Hyo-shin, at the moment Lee Young-ji, but abroad it seems to be the groups of large members. And I've read different articles about why that is, and it's all academic or it's like Orientalism and things. But what's your take on that? What's your opinion? Why is it the groups that are popular and not the individuals?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a clear answer for that, but like just based on like my own observations, I feel like, part of it has to do with, obviously, if it's an idol group, like you have multiple people, so like everyone will have at least one bias, right? Like one member that they're particularly drawn to. And also, if you look at a lot of the idol groups, like, they're all like uniformly good looking, right? Yeah. And they can dance well, their choreography is on point, and they also tend to have like very slickly produced music videos. I mean, of course, like, many of the solo artists also have like, very well produced music videos, but I just feel like, you just have like more people to choose from in a group, simply speaking.
It's the Backstreet Boys all over again, isn't it? It's that thing.
Or the Spice Girls.
Ginger Spice. I was the Ginger Spice fan when I was.
Oh, I like Baby Spice.
We all have our bias. How deep do you think K-pop goes, Regina? And by what I mean by that is, in your piece for Elle, you were looking at artists that didn't always get the spotlight, and so it's easy to write about sort of BTS or Blackpink or aespa these days, but you tried to go a little bit more into the weeds, as it were. How deep do you think K-pop goes? Is there depth to the genre, or is there a problem of oversaturation, difficulty in standing out? And what's, if you're doing something completely different like Dreamcatcher, then you get that element of it. But what's the depth of quality in K-pop, do you think?
I mean, again, like this is a complex question to answer, because also it's like, how do you even define K-pop? And like, I know that's like a whole nother conversation, right? But
how do you define it, by the way? How do you define K-pop?
Gosh, like I just have like multiple definitions like floating around in my mind, and like, I mean, really the shortest answer that I can give you is like, it just depends on like who I'm talking with. I know that's a horrible answer, but and to be quite honest, like I don't really listen to the kind of K-pop that is popular outside of Korea nowadays. I mean, like if I'm writing a piece about some K-pop artists, like, I will check out some of their songs, but like I don't really regularly listen to a lot of the K-pop songs that are popular nowadays. Although like I will say that BTS is probably an exception. I have grown to really love their music, but like the kind of K-pop that I grew up listening to, like again, Fly to the Sky, TVXQ, or like 동방신기,
right?
They just sounded like very different from the K-pop artists that are very popular nowadays, and so I'm just trying to like figure out how to say this without like sounding offensive, but how like we've heard a lot of people saying that like there seems to be kind of like this overall like homogenization of popular music around the world. Like I know even like some American artists have like come out and said that, but I do feel like that's the case with both American and Korean pop music nowadays. When it comes to K-pop, to be quite honest, like sometimes I feel like there's almost like a new group coming out every week.
Yep.
And who knows, like maybe there is. Like I think I remember reading like one article that said like something like 200 K-pop groups debuted in 1 year or something. They're just like way too many nowadays to keep track of, right? And I do like kind of yearn for like simpler times. Like, but so yeah, like I know I'm not really answering your question, but I mean, if you're talking about for example, like AKMU, like Akdong musician, as being a K-pop artist, I love them. Like I would normally consider them as K-pop as well, but they're like one of those artists who for some reason are just not really popular in many places outside of Korea. I mean, they're definitely not popular in the US. Like very few people in the US have heard of them, which I think is really unfortunate. So if you're including artists like AKMU and IU in K-pop, then I mean, yes, like I think there is a lot of depth, but that's why I'm like, it's hard for me to answer that question, because like it depends on like how you define K-pop. And like if I were to like talk about AKMU with many folks in America, they'd be like, what?
AKMU are great because they write their own stuff, and they're always changing, and they fabulous musicians, voices as well. Their last EP, like 6-7 track EP, I thought was just really, really, really good. You mentioned this kind of homogenization of music, not just K-pop, but American music. I'm not sure if you've heard this, the work of Mark Fisher, but I'll just give it to you very quickly because I've used it in some of my writing recently and research. And Mark Fisher was a British sort of music cultural critic, no longer with us, but he had this thought experiment. And if you've watched Back to the Future, you'll get it. But he sort of said that music has stopped, right? The music stopped in the 2000s. And the way he explained it is, he said that if you got music from the 1950s, let's just talk Western music for now, but if you got music from the 1950s, took it back to the 20s, the people in the 20s would go, what is this? It's too loud. This is rock and roll. We're used to jazz, right? Music's become louder and noisier and it's worse. And then if you went to the 70s and you got all that kind of like rock, heavy metal, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, and you took that back to the 50s, people would go, oh my God, this is ridiculous. We don't understand it. Then you get the invention of hip hop turntables. You get the synthesizers, right? Technological huge breakthroughs. You take it back 20 years, people don't get it. I think he argued that if you took music from today back to 2000, people would get it. They would just go, yeah, it's still Elton John, it's Dua Lipa doing funk, it's Ed Sheeran, it's Coldplay. But there's been no change, technological genre in music for like the last 20 years. And so the change now is, it's just and I don't say this disrespectfully, the change now is the identity of the people doing it rather than the music itself. So we still get the pop, but now we get, let's say, Asian people doing it or Korean people doing it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I think I kind of have to agree. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to offend any, like hardcore K-pop fans out there, but again, in some sense, I consider myself to be a K-pop fan, but I'm a fan of the first and second generation K-pop artists. So, but that's just my personal taste.
Yeah, everyone has taste, and I think it's important to talk about our tastes or our thoughts and our feelings. I've always found it interesting that, sometimes we might talk about politics or economics or movies, and everyone has their opinions, but it's hard to talk about sometimes K-pop, critically. That always seems difficult. Keep going on this then, perhaps. My kids love aespa. My kids are 6 and 7, but they love aespa. They do all the dance moves and this kind of stuff and sing the songs. They're doing this kind of metaverse, NFT, digital realms, avatars, buying stuff online. What's your take on this as the future of K-pop? I know you're a second generation person, so it might be hard to get into, but is K-pop going online? Are we going to see a sea change from YouTube to metaverses? Is it just a fad? Do you understand it? What's your take on this part of it?
Do I understand it? Honestly, I don't know if I do, but I think there is a lot of potential there, but just based on, the reporting that I've done, the research that I've done, I think one of the potential, I think one of the important things that these, K-pop agencies have to keep in mind is you can't get too complicated with the storytelling or the terminology. So for example, when I was writing that MTV News article about aespa, it was actually commissioned to me by one of the MTV News editors, and that's why I actually wrote it. I had no idea about the whole SM universe until I started doing research for the article. And then I just quickly realized oh my gosh, what are all these terms that are being used, Hwangya and sync and recall, and what is, or who is novice? I started having all these questions, and I was I have to do research on this. And initially, I remember I started looking up English language articles, and many of them were just confusing and contradictory. And I was okay, I'll try searching Korean language articles. So maybe, these Korean journalists will understand something that we don't. And it was the same thing. Actually, I felt some of the Korean language articles that I came across, it felt like the journalists were even more clueless than some of the American journalists. So I was okay, so you know, I honestly like tried my best to understand what all those terms meant, and I tried to kind of like go into the whole like, I don't know, like mythology, but to be quite honest, like it was very challenging, and I think that could be a potentially major impediment for, you know, people trying to like understand this whole like SM universe. So like I think they just need to like just simplify the terminology and just I don't know, just sometimes like, you know, creating a complicated metaverse is not the answer.
I agree with you, but we might be in the minority. I mean, these record companies,
Yeah.
they know what we're doing. Maybe the young kids get it. But yeah, that's an interesting one to see that they are going online, and I'm still unsure who Novice is or how this all works.
I mean, I think I eventually like figured most of it out, but again, it just took a lot of digging. And so like the question is like, you know, how many of these fans and potential fans are willing to do all that digging?
Sure. My 6-7-year-old kids don't care about that. They just want to hear the song.
Okay.
Daddy, next level, please. Okay. When I want to talk about the Hallyu trend in this K-pop thing, in terms of its longevity. So now I know that you can't speak for all of Netflix, and I know also that you don't have a crystal ball. If you do, please give me the lottery numbers. But in terms of looking forward, different people I speak to have different ideas on how long this huge cultural global phenomenon is going to last. And so, for example, Igutak told me, Professor, he told me that it's going to go from strength to strength. It's going to get bigger. Platforms streaming more international. And then I spoke to Professor Kwon Jung-min, and she said, well, it used to be Hong Kong, and then it was Japan, now it's Korea, and so she believes it's going to pass on in a few years. So there's lots of different opinions, and nobody really knows. But what do you see in the future for Hallyu, for this Korean music and drama phenomenon? And do your heart and your head tell you different things, or how does this play out going forward, Regina?
I mean, I think like at least in the near future, like this whole Hallyu phenomenon is going to continue to grow, like across the globe. And I say that because, like, you know, as you know, like, you know, I feel like Koreans are all about quality. Like they really care about quality. They really care about like every single detail. And I feel like they're always like trying to innovate, which is great, you know. And I feel like, you know, one of the reasons why Hallyu has become as big as it is today is that like Koreans, like the Koreans who are involved in the entertainment industry, I feel like a lot of them are, you know, willing to see what's out there and like learn from other cultures and like pick up on the latest trends. And you know, I imagine that they will continue to do that going forward. And like as long as they continue to do that, and as long as like and you know, obviously like when it comes to like Korean films and K-dramas, I mean, like they've always had like such great storytelling, right? So I can't imagine that like, you know, that kind of like powerful emotional storytelling is going to end in the future. So as long as like I think Koreans can maintain that when it comes to like Korean film and K-dramas, and continue, you know, trying to innovate and learn from the latest trends and other cultures, like I think we'll continue to see the Hallyu phenomenon grow. And with K-pop, like I mean, I think they're constantly innovating as well. So I mean, I don't know if or when it's going to end. I hope it's going to like continue to grow, but like I'll also say that like I really do hope to see, you know, not just like Korean content, but like content from like other countries, like, you know, continue to do better, or like, you know, as well as Korean content. Because like, you know, I feel like the more diverse stories we share, and the more diverse stories that we like hear about, like the better, right? Like it enriches all of us. So yeah,
I completely agree with that. I think the more unique and individual stories and sounds and concepts and words and visuals that we get, the better it is. which is why I think that sort of like homogenization is it's a bit boring. You know, it's nice and it's safe, but prefer to get that difference. I think that's really good. If we move from K-pop then to this third topic that you've written about in a couple of your pieces, which I also think is important. You meant, and that's, and I hope I get the words right, so please correct me if I misstep. You write about race and identity, and in May last year you wrote an incredibly powerful piece for Elle, which you already referenced, saying you can't stand Korean entertainment without also standing up against anti-Asian racism. And in that piece, Regina, you asked the question directly: how is it possible that when Asians are finally starting to be seen as cool and hip in the West, we're also being brutally attacked and even killed on a regular basis, often in broad daylight? Was this a difficult piece to write for you? Did you get much response to it? Can you help us unpack that piece for us, please?
Yeah, like I mentioned before, like, you know, I want to say it was probably my most popular, like definitely one of my most popular pieces that I've written. And yeah, like the response was like overwhelming. But I will say that that piece was actually commissioned to me by a couple of the Elle editors. Like they were looking for someone of Asian descent who was knowledgeable about Korean pop culture. And like actually around that time, I was starting to work on that Elle piece about the history of K-dramas. And so like, because I was already in contact with them, they're like, hey, can you like, you know, write this op-ed? And they basically like, you know, told me what the topic would be. And I was like, to be quite honest, like initially I was like, oh my gosh, like, I don't know if I can write about this, you know, it's just going to be like too painful. And I honestly didn't really know what to write at the time. It's like, how do you tackle such a complex and, you know, painful topic? But I did, you know, I felt like I had a responsibility, right? Because like, if I wasn't going to write it, like, I don't know who else was going to write it. And, you know, like, I don't even know if the editors at the time, like really knew who else to reach out to. So I was like, okay, fine, I'll write it. And I just started like jotting down some like, you know, random ideas and feelings that I had just, you know, based on my own experiences of like observing anti-Asian racism, even here in New York City. Like, I mean, during the pandemic, like I would hear stories about like people of Asian descent just getting brutally attacked right here in New York City, you know, which is supposed to be like, you know, one of the most diverse and cosmopolitan cities in the world. And yet like you hear and you see like, well, I mean, I didn't see anyone like personally, but like I know people, like even my mom, who's like, you know, seeing witness like people who were hurt. So it was definitely like one of my more painful pieces to write. And in the beginning, it was just like, I was just word vomiting onto a page. And then I think somehow like within like a day or so, I just like started like fiercely like writing down like full sentences. And it just like kind of came to me. It was weird. It was like this really like weird experience. Like once I had jotted down like some, you know, feelings and emotions that I had, I was like, how am I gonna like, you know, write this into a coherent op-ed? And then I just like, it just somehow happened. It's weird. Like, I don't know how to describe it.
Why do you think it resonated so much? Like, why do you think it got the response that it did? Because you said it was, you know, perhaps the piece that, what was it, do you think?
I mean, you know, like it was interesting because when I shared that piece on my social media, and you know, I have to be honest, like I don't really have many social media followers, but like for some reason, like when I shared that like on my LinkedIn and like I think my Twitter as well, and I mean, I saw notable Asians and Asian Americans liking and sharing my post, like my article. And even like, and you know, like I didn't know any of them personally, but like some of them even like, you know, DM'd me and was like, thank you so much for writing this piece. Like it felt like you know, we were all kind of, you know, as Asians and Asian Americans, like we were all kind of like feeling the same kinds of emotions, but like I don't know how many of us felt comfortable like writing about them, and how many of us were actually allowed to like, you know, write about our emotions. And so I guess again, like I sometimes I look back on that piece and like yeah, like I have to say like I was proud of it, because I just, you know, just because like I've received like such positive responses from different people. But I guess like I was somehow able to like encapsulate like all the different emotions and experiences that many of us Asian Americans were experiencing during that time. And some of us are still experiencing now, because like you still see some, you know, some instances of like attacks happening against Asian Americans here, unfortunately.
It was I can only speak from my experience, but it was a very powerful piece, and I could see how it resonated across not just social media, but people's lives, as you've said, and how they would contact you. In that article, Regina, you quoted Susan Lee, the writer, saying that it's possible the obsession with K-dramas and K-pop has actually made some people more racist because they think they understand being Korean, so they get a pass on racist thoughts and tendencies. When I read that kind of stuck out to me, because, you know, it seems a little bit contradictory. You would imagine that it goes the other way, that the more Korean content becomes popular, the more representation, awareness, the reduction of ignorance. But this was suggesting that it sort of becomes easier to talk about them in perhaps non-polite or offensive ways. What was your take on that idea, Regina, from Susan Lee?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, like when she wrote that, I was like, oh, like my initial reaction was like, yeah, that just seems like kind of counterintuitive. But then she actually wrote that in response to a tweet that was shared by you know, this famous novelist, Korean American novelist named Aro Kwon. And she had like shared screenshots of like what I guess this person professing to be like an elderly white lady who likes Korean pop culture and watches Korean dramas. Like she basically like wrote to Aro Kwon, and she like she said some like very strangely like stereotypical things about Koreans, and just very like racist things about Koreans. It was a very like strange message. And throughout her message, she also said how much she loved Korean culture, and she's like, oh, like I'm not racist, I can't be racist because hey, like I watch K-dramas all the time. So you know, that like there was proof right there, right? That like what Susan said, it could very well in fact be true. And I thought, like I've thought about that like ever since, you know, I came across those tweets. And you know, sometimes, I mean, I want to say, and like I would like to think that, you know, because Korean culture has become so popular across the globe, and like more recently in the US as well, like I would like to think that like, it's opened up people's minds, and people have become more accepting and appreciative of like not just Korean culture, but like, you know, people of Korean descent. But at the same time, like, you know, sometimes I wonder if some of these people are just like so fascinated with and obsessed by Korea, or like fascinated by and obsessed with Korean culture because it's like some sort of like fetish that they have. You know, I wonder about that, because like, you know, I look at some of these like K-drama fans, for instance, and like, you know, some of them like I can tell are like, you know, just like very genuinely curious and interested. But then, you know, sometimes I wonder, like, you know, like, is it a fetish that they have? Like, I don't know. You know, like, I don't want to like offend, you know, any like Korean pop culture fans. Like, I don't want to pass any judgment either. But, you know, it is very interesting. And, you know, whether I've seen some of these people like, you know, be racist at the same time and arbor stereotypes, Personally, no, I haven't. Like that instance, like that I mentioned in my Elle article, like was really like the only instance that I came across. But then I remember like people were like, you know, reaching out to me on Twitter saying like, oh yeah, like I've seen this happen. So yeah. So like if they say that, like I'm pretty sure yeah, it happens.
You mentioned fetishization. I've had people suggest that to me, that there is that element of it, that there is, that does go on. We could get into Ollie London and things like that, but let's skip on, because at
Yeah.
the at the end of your piece, at the end of that piece, you start to give concrete suggestions on what people could do to help the community, but to help themselves. And you suggest reading more history, listening more, speaking up, and introspect. Since you wrote that piece 6 months ago, do you think there's been any change? Are things getting better, worse? Did they stay the same? Or how has your view changed since you wrote that to now, Regina?
Yeah. I mean, overall, like I hate to say this, but like I think things have pretty much stayed the same. I mean, when it comes to you know, like combating anti-Asian racism, at least in the US, like I haven't really seen that much progress. And I mean, you know, a large part of it is because like Asian Americans are such a small minority in the US. And it also doesn't help that, you know, we're definitely not a monolith, right? And we
Right.
all have different cultures, we all speak different languages. I mean, like the Chinese, like even here where I live in New York City, like in Flushing, there's a huge Korean population and there's also a very huge Chinese population. And like the communities like don't really mingle either, you know? It's like, I mean, like it's really hard because like we don't even speak the same language.
Mm-hmm.
So so to start off, like you have, you know, Asian Americans making what I think is like maybe 6 or 7% of the US. And then within that 6 or 7%, you have all these different communities who speak different languages who can't communicate with each other. So it's just really hard to have like the same level of solidarity that you might see with, for example, like African Americans, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like that's that's a core reason why we have not really seen that much change. I mean, that said, you know, like I have seen a lot of like Asian Americans like you know, coming out into the streets and like protesting. But again, like we just don't really have the numbers. I
Mm-hmm.
hate to say that. And I think like, you know, there's still very much like this whole model minority myth. I mean, you know, ever since this wave of anti-Asian attacks have started, like, I mean, I think, you know, more people in the US have become aware of how harmful this model minority myth is, but like there's still so many, you know, like so many people out there that you know, feel like Asians don't really have any problems. Like everything is okay with the Asian American community. Like we're all doing well. We're all like, you know, very well off, and oftentimes like, you know, there are many people who don't treat Asian Americans as a minority. Like they don't think we're a minority. So it's really hard to have our voices heard even today. Yeah, and to be quite honest, like it's also one of the reasons why I'm contemplating a possible move to South Korea sometime in the future.
You'd be more than welcome. Let's have coffee if you come. Can I just ask you about the model minority myth that you've mentioned? Because it's not something that I see written about much in the Korean language press here in Korea, or so perhaps I'm not as well I'm not as well versed in it. But can you perhaps just try to unpack it a bit for me, and like how prevalent it is?
I mean, oh my gosh, it just has like so many different components to it that like I think if you were to actually try to explain what it is, you could you could devote an entire like hour-long episode to talking about the model minority myth. And like I know there are lots of podcasts who have tackled this topic, but like I mean, to me, you know, I would say that like part of the model minority myth here in the US is that there's this kind of like stereotype of Asian Americans as being like, you know, uh like very like, you know, good mannered, polite, quiet, hardworking model citizens. We're like, good people that don't cause any trouble. We just like, keep our heads down and just, just do our work. We don't speak up. And I feel like sometimes like there is some truth to it, like, unfortunately. I mean, I think part of it has to do with like Asian cultures and like the way that many of us are raised. Like for many of us living in the States, our Asian parents will tell us like, oh, just just focus on your work, study hard, go to a good school, and then like once you graduate, like, you'll get a good job, and just do your job, just be hardworking, and like you'll be successful. And that's oftentimes like not the case in the US, right? You have to like speak up sometimes. And here it's very much feel like the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? Like that's how people get promoted. And so like when you actually look across corporate America, for example, not that many people know this, but actually like Asian Americans are the least likely to be promoted in the US, even though many of us are well educated, right? Many of us like, do work for like reputable companies, but still like many of us are at like the junior level or like the mid-manager level. Like very few of us are at the senior level or at the executive management level. Like even to this day, it's really hard to find Asian Americans who are like, at the C-suite level. And all of that is, partly due to this whole model minority myth. Like people just expect us to like keep our heads down, not complain, right? But if you don't speak up, if you don't like at least, raise trouble sometime, or like, point like just make people aware of like some of the issues that you have to deal with, and like people are not going to pay attention to you, and that's part of the model minority myth. And because like I guess like so many of us like I want to say like there's this perception in America that many Asian Americans are wealthy because many of us like go to like very prestigious schools. They think like as a whole, like, Asian Americans, like don't have any struggles. Like Americans don't really need to pay attention to Asian Americans because like, we have all of our, like, we don't have any problems. Like everything is fine and dandy for us. And that's also not true, right? Because like, for example, even here in New York City, like we have like tons of undocumented Asian immigrants. And even the ones that are documented, you still have a ton of Asian Americans who are living below the federal poverty line. But it's like they're almost kind of invisible. Like people don't really talk about that. The media definitely doesn't really talk about that. And if you also look at, like different groups of Asian Americans, like for example, especially like, like Lao or like Cambodian Americans, like many of them are also, on average, like not as better off as like some of the more affluent Asian American groups, like, Indian Americans or Chinese Americans or Korean Americans. So like, there's just like, so basically like, I know this is a lot. I don't know if I did a good job of like explaining it, but like, that's why like this whole model minority myth is just such a complex topic that needs to be addressed, right? With nuance, but it's something that just doesn't really get covered that much in media, at least in mainstream media. And I feel like it's usually like, Asian Americans who have to talk about this. So it's, yeah.
You've definitely made me think about it more seriously because I must confess it's not something that I've heard about much. So it's good that you've brought it not just to my attention, but to other people's attention. You said, Regina, that you felt that not much had changed in the past 6 months since you wrote your article, and the way that manifests with these stereotypes of the model minority myth. What would you like to see change, or what could people do that would bring about that change, if you know what I mean? So you said that nothing's really happened. You wrote this piece and you gave some suggestions, but since that, there hasn't been that much movement. what would you like to see happen, or what could people do that would bring about actual change?
Oh, yeah, that's like another hard question.
Not sure if that's harder or easier than to define K-pop, but it's a question.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, well, okay, for starters, you know, I really wish that, you know, I really wish that the government, like the U.S. government, would, and I think, you know, especially with the current Biden administration, like they are, like, you know, paying more attention to some of the problems that are commonly faced by Asian American communities. But I think there definitely like needs to be more attention paid to like some of the unique problems that many Asian American communities face. And for starters, like I don't think a lot of these issues that are I would say like unique to Asian American communities are very well understood outside of these communities. Like, for example, I mean, I remember, you know, like when you know, when local elections were taking place in New York, and like you had like different candidates who were like, you know, talking about their proposed policy changes and whatnot. And I mean, when this whole question of like, okay, what would you do to address you know, Asian hate crimes that are happening in the US, like none of them really had a good answer. And like I know that like it's a very difficult topic, but like even just having first of all, just like having conversations, right, with different members of the Asian American communities, and really, you know, trying to understand some of their daily struggles. I think even like, you know, like those kinds of efforts are not really being done in many cases. Like they just like assume that like, oh, there's like this language barrier. It's just like very easy for, I think, even today for many Americans to just, you know, see an Asian face and just like automatically treat, you know, that Asian American person or like that Asian person as other, right? Like Asian Americans are just like so used to being othered and dehumanized. You definitely saw that with you know, like the Atlanta area spa shootings that happened last year, right? I mean, just look at like the way that American media covered it. You know, if they had just like made an effort to like, you know, approach some of the members of the local Korean American community in Atlanta. And it's crazy because like I remember like in the beginning, like there were so many like Korean American journalists who spoke Korean who wanted to go and cover the story, and like, you know, for some reason like they weren't allowed to do that, at least initially. So you have to kind of wonder like, what's going on there, right? But I think that's, you know, one of the first things that needs to be addressed is like, you know, how do you reach out to these local communities and talk to them to figure out like, you know, what their challenges are? Because like there's just like no, even now, like there isn't really a widespread understanding of some of the, you know, daily challenges that many Asian Americans face. You know, there are many of us who are undocumented, again, like many of us who both undocumented and documented, who are very poor. We're living below the federal poverty line for various reasons that I won't get into. And another thing that I would like to see happen is like more mutual understanding between specifically like the Asian American and the African American communities. Because I mean, these two communities have so many similarities. We have so many shared struggles, but like, I feel like especially the media, the mainstream media, like tends to kind of divide us or want to divide us. And there's these like, you know, various narratives that are being pushed out where it's almost like, you know, they're pitting like African American communities against Asian American communities. And so like, I mean, for many years, right? Like there have been so many like misunderstandings between these two communities for, again, like for various reasons, but like there's so many, like we share so many commonalities. And so just, I would say like figuring out different ways to like bring these two communities together in solidarity. Like, I mean, I do see some of that happening, especially with like the younger generations, like, well, like with the millennial generations and like with the Gen Z generation. And, you know, but I feel like there's a lot more that can be done, because like I see a lot of like finger pointing and just, you know, blaming the other. But if you really, you know, look at our histories and look at, you know, some of the challenges that both of our communities face, like, yeah, like there are a lot of like shared struggles there.
I think it's really important.
I mean, I'll be like, can I just like give like one example? And I don't know, maybe this might be like very foreign to a lot of your listeners if they're based in Korea, but like, you know, in America, for example, you know, there's been a lot of talk about like police reform, right? And especially like within the African American community, you know, there is a lot of distrust between like ordinary like African American citizens and the police, right? And they think like, oh, like, you know, all, you know, Asian Americans are like, you know, like they wouldn't support this cause, or, you know, they would probably be the first ones to like, you know, call the police and whatnot, blah blah. But I mean, like, for example, like where I live in Flushing here in Queens, like there are like also many like Asian Americans who don't really trust the police either, because, you know, just for various reasons, like and I don't, you know, like, and like I'm not trying to like, you know, like criticize, or like I'm not trying to be like dismissive of the police, and like I know that there are many police officers here in the US who are, you know, honorable and, you know, like hardworking, and, you know, they do a great job. But like it's just like, you know, I'm just saying, like, you know, that's like one of the issues where I think like there's a lot of overlap between the African American and Asian American communities that like people just aren't really aware of.
I think the talking part is really important, and, you know, sort of actual having conversations, you said, not just making policies or things like that. I've often come to understand that it's important to talk to people rather than talk about people. It's very easy to talk about groups and to label people, but to actually talk to people or listen to people, talk with people plays a great role. And that idea of politicians or media or people dividing, I think does take place, because that reinforces the current power in the systems, you know, by keeping people separate from each other.
Sorry, can I just add like one more thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
On this topic, like, you know, I honestly did not like expect to like be talking about like, because it's a very sensitive topic, right? Like in the US. But it's going back to like the media, right? And I mean, I don't know how much of this gets shown like in Korea or like really like anywhere outside of the US, but like here in the US, you know, you will see for example, like the media showing like, you know, African Americans like being the perpetrators of like many of these like anti-Asian hate crimes. And like right now there you know, there are a lot of Asian Americans who, you know, feel like, you know, oh, like, you know, it's mostly like the African Americans who are like attacking us. But again, like to me, I feel like that's kind of like the narrative that, you know, like some of these media outlets like to push out, because you know, if you look online, and even just, you know, based on what I've heard from, you know, people living, like various people living in my neighborhood, you know, it's like a lot of these anti-Asian hate crimes are, you know, also, like are also being committed by, you know, like white people or like, you know, Hispanic people, not just like African Americans. It's just like you don't really see a lot of that like in mainstream media. So anyway, so it's, yeah, I could like I could do like a whole nother discussion on this topic, but I know it's kind of like controversial, and it might make some people feel uncomfortable, but like you just, yeah, you just have to be aware, especially here in the US, so like what you see in the media is not the entire truth, right? So
I agree with that, and the coverage in South Korea was very much as you described it there. That was, you know, Korean media is not monolith, and they all have different things, left and right biases, but the general mainstream television and print news was as you described it. So
because it's so much easier for these mainstream media outlets to pit two minority groups against each other, right? If you look at like who dominates you know, a lot of these mainstream outlets, you know, it's Caucasians, right? And sorry, like I know you're Caucasian, so like, you know, I don't mean to like, you know, it's a weird topic for me to talk about, but it's just like the whole complexity of, you know, race relations. I mean, no matter no matter like, you know, what race or ethnicity you are, like, you know, every race, you know, has its good and bad people, right? It's as simple as that, right? So it's just, I guess basically what I'm trying to say is that like, I don't want people to just like generalize about an entire race of people based on what you see in the media, you know. Again, you know, if you take the whole example of the Atlanta the Atlanta area spa shootings that happened last March, you know, that was where, you know, this lone white man just like gunned down all these people, mostly Asian women, right? What happened, right? Like the media and the police like kind of almost sided with the suspect, with the perpetrator. I mean, he just came out and said like, oh, like, you know, I was having a bad day. And they just like took it. They just like took it. I mean, they just like took his word at face value. So that just like goes to show, I mean, I think that's like, you know, one striking example of how like it's just so easy for, I think, like the media and also for law enforcement to really like control the narrative, you know. If like sometimes I wonder, like, you know, if the perpetrator were like, say, a Black person, you know, like would the sheriff have come out and said, oh, like, you know, let's cut him some slack because he was just having a bad day, you know? Like, no, like that would not have happened. But that suspect was able to get away with saying that, I think, because he was a white man and because, you know, the sheriff, well, I mean, later on, they also found that the sheriff was racist because like he uploaded some like racist posts on his Facebook, I believe. So yeah, that's why you just have to like question everything that you see in the media.
Well, if we look at that perhaps more systemic thing, because throughout this interview, Regina, you've told me, and even with the you can't stand Korean entertainment without standing up against anti-Asian racism, you said these pieces were commissioned to you. So obviously it happens that what we as readers see in the media, a lot of it is being commissioned, it's being directed, right, for good or for bad, whether it's please write about this group, please do this. How do you think that plays, not just in terms of Hallyu, but not just terms of race and media narratives and division? How do you think that plays across more broadly, this idea of people commissioning work and telling people to write certain things?
I mean, are we trying to like tie this into like what I was just talking about, or?
No, what I'm trying to ask is, the narratives are created, and created by who, I'm trying to ask, and is it just it's not just in terms of race, but it's even more broader? Because the reason I ask, actually, this is the honest reason I ask, I don't get people commissioning me work, right? So I just write what I want. I have a column I can write, and it's free. So I was curious about what it would be like, the experience of having to be commissioned to write about, for example, race, the anti-Asian racism, or how does that play into it at all? Does it, or it's not connected?
Well, I can say that like the pieces where I, you know, talk about race, like out of all the pieces that I talk about race, like I would say like, I think, yeah, only that particular Elle op-ed was commissioned. And, you know, it came during a time when like, I mean, you know, all like it felt like, you know, every media outlet in the US was all of a sudden like starting to talk about anti-Asian racism and like Asian hate crimes. Like a year late, I mean, this whole like pandemic of like Asian hate, I would say, had started, like you started seeing this surge in anti-Asian hate, like I would say like around March 2020, which is like, you know, when when the lockdowns started due to COVID. So I mean, this wave of anti-Asian hate crimes had been happening for a whole year, and during that time, like you didn't really see the media really talking about it, really like showing it. I mean, like you might see like, you know, some incidents like here and there, but like which is very sporadic, and people weren't talking about it at all. And then it's like, oh yeah, like I mean, when those Asian women got shot in Atlanta, again, like in March, it was like almost like exactly a year later, right? In March 2021, all of a sudden, like people just started talking about anti-Asian hate and all these hate crimes that were happening against Asian Americans. And it was just like, yeah. And so I guess like, you know, the Elle editors, like they also wanted to run at least one piece that addressed it in some way. And, you know, it's, again, like since I was already in contact with them, like they naturally reached out to me. And, you know, like I think it's great that they decided to do that, that they gave me the opportunity to write about it.
Yeah.
But I remember like that whole time, like, I mean, come on, like, you know, like Asians were getting attacked and even murdered for a whole year. And it took that long for people to notice. So again, just going back to this whole issue of like, you know, Asian Americans kind of being like the invisible minority. And that also ties into the whole model minority myth. Like, you know, we're the ones that are supposed to like basically like, you know, be quiet and not complain. Yeah, I mean, I could go on and on about this. And I mean, I don't know, again, like, I just don't know like how, because like even here in America, like these are somewhat like controversial topics to talk about. So that's why I'm just like kind of, it's just really hard for, like, I don't know how articulate I'm being at the moment, but like it's, yeah.
But I will say that I'm listening, I'm understanding, and I can feel not only how important it is, but I understand the complexity of the issue, which is why, you know, it's interesting to talk about it rather than just read a piece, which is that kind of one-way information. But your pieces were great on that, and you know, they obviously resonated. If we can, I want to turn towards the next section, which looks, I guess, then ahead at your story, Regina, because you've already achieved so much. You've written so many things in so many places, but where does the Regina Kim story go from here? Is there an end goal? Is there an ultimate vision in what you're doing? Is there something that you could do that you would think, yeah, I did that, that's it? What comes next?
Well, I mean, to be quite honest, like I hope to like be able to continue writing about, you know, happy things. Like I want to continue writing about like, you know, K-dramas and K-pop and just like, you know, promoting Korean pop culture in general and
crime dramas. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just really hard for me to like, you know, write or like, you know, even talk about like, you know, painful topics and but like, you know, again, like I'm glad that you asked me those questions, but it's just one of those things that, you know, like even for many like American audiences, I think it would be hard for people to really like grasp. Like you just, anyway. So what happens in my future? I mean, I feel like I feel like my goalpost is like constantly moving, and I imagine like, you know, that's probably the case for a lot of other people as well. But yeah. I remember like, you know, just a decade ago, you know, like I remember thinking like, oh, I hope I can find a job where I can just, you know, write about Korean culture and get paid for it and, you know, find a way to like, you know, help promote Korean culture. And I mean, that's what I'm doing today. So, but now it's like, you know, I want to, you know, write more articles, you know, become a more prolific writer. I want to, you know, obviously like, you know, continue writing for Netflix as well as for other publications. And honestly, like I want to write a screenplay. I want to finish a screenplay. It's been like on the back burner for like so long. And it's funny because like, I mean, I have like various screenplays that I've just kind of like started, but like haven't really finished. And they all, pertain to like either like Korean culture or like the Korean American experience, but like, um, like in recent years, as again, like as Korean culture has just like really exploded, I feel like I'll have to like revisit some of those scripts and just kind of like rewrite some of those things, like, oh yeah, like this is no longer relevant, like people are very much aware of like Korean pop culture. So but it's just, yeah, something that I hope to like achieve
What kind of
soon.
things are the screenplays about? Are they crime dramas as well, or
No,
any
no,
common
no.
themes, or do we get
I
any
would
insight?
never, I would never be able to write about. I would never be able to write crime dramas. Like I just don't think I have the intellect for it. I love watching them, but like I would never be able to craft one. No, but like like romance stories, and just like there's one that's like really drawn from my own personal experiences, just growing up as a Korean American, as like like literally like the like one of like maybe three or four Asian Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
I think my family was like one of only like two or three Asian families in the entire like city where I grew up in Georgia. So that in itself was a was an interesting experience. And just like going through high school as like one of like the only Asian students, and then going to a college where like all of a sudden like I was just surrounded by so many Asian students, and I'm also like surrounded by lots of wealthy people. Because I also I like where I grew up in Georgia, many of the families, including mine, were like working class or like lower middle class, and then just going from that to like an Ivy League school where like you're constantly surrounded by like the wealthiest 1% of American society. So that was definitely a culture shock. So just kind of like drawing on my experiences there.
I look forward to watching it. Whenever I've been doing my work, I remember when I was doing my PhD, and someone
Mm-hmm.
told me, David, there's two types of PhD dissertations: perfect ones and finished ones. So I did a finished one, because you could spend years and years and you never quite get it. You never quite get it, and it kind of motivated me. Sometimes you just have to finish something. But I look forward to that. I'm going to ask you one last question, Regina, and we've perhaps touched on elements of this already, but we're all in this world together. So I'd like to ask you, what is the purpose of life? What should we be living for? And how can we make more people's experiences here more rewarding and valuable?
Oh my God. That's a very deep philosophical question. That's like the age-old question, right?
Yep,
Like, what's the purpose of life? Like, why are we here? What's the meaning of life?
that's the question.
Uh, I mean, if I had, I don't think there's like one single answer to that, right? Like, I don't think there's just like one right answer to that. But like, I guess for me, personally, I guess like my answer at the moment would be, just to like find out what your passion is, and just keep pursuing it. I believe that each and every one of us is given our own unique talents, and we have to figure out like how to use those talents to make an impact on the world, on other people's lives. And so I mean that's what I hope to do and to continue doing. I feel like I have found my passion, which is like finding ways to like write about like Korean culture, and like write about my own heritage, and just to kind of like inform and educate people about like Korean culture, especially since like again like it's just like it's blowing up.
Mm.
But like whether it's like making a positive impact on the world, I don't know, but I hope so. It's just like my way of like I guess like contributing to the universe in some way. But I mean I think that's you just have to like find what makes you happy, right? What you're passionate about, and then I think the rest will kind of just fall into place. And I have to say that like just based on my own experience, like it took me a long it took me a long time to find the courage to like really pursue my passion. Part of it was because of course, there's always a risk, right? Like there's always a risk that like if you go all in on something, then like it might not go well, like you might fail, and then what happens? And so like I for a very long time I just kind of like struggled with like, well, I know my passion is finding ways to promote Korean culture, but like can I actually make a living doing it? Like can I actually be able to like pay the rent and pay the bills? And that's another reason why like for a very long time partly because like a lot of the like the writing and journalism positions in general don't pay well in the US. Like it's a travesty. Like I don't know why, but like I find that like journalists are like one of the best educated yet like worst paid people in the US. Like if you're talking about like white collar jobs, like I wouldn't be surprised if like journalism is like one of the lowest paying jobs. So it was just really hard for me to like pursue journalism full time, and I just had to like take on all these other like full-time jobs that paid a lot better. But now now I finally found a place that actually like pays me really well and like pays me to do what I'm passionate about. So yeah, and I hope the same, I hope a lot of people out there will be able to like experience that same, I guess, happiness when it comes to their career.
Being paid to play sometimes. I think the biggest that's what it's like. It doesn't feel like work. It feels like you're enjoying what you do.
Well, I still have to like pitch ideas and write articles. But no, actually, trust me, like when you know that you have to like finish watching a certain number of TV shows and write an article about those shows by a certain deadline, you do feel some pressure.
I can imagine. I think one of the important things, though, like you said, though, is that passion. And I think one of the hardest things sometimes for people to do is to find the passion in the first place. Like a sense of kind of, well, I don't know, this person's into art and this person's into horse riding, but I don't know what I like. And that's sometimes, I think, the biggest difficult step for people, to find that thing in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that, like, I think for many of us, though, like, there's always that inner voice. And I know it sounds like very cliche, like when people say, they're like, oh, you have to listen to your inner voice. And I remember like hearing that so many times, like growing up, but like, I never really like, I guess I never really took it seriously. But like now that I look back, like, yeah, like for a very long time, like probably since like high school even, there was that inner voice of like, oh, like I want to do something, related to like, like promoting Korean culture and just like, like educating people about like my own heritage. But it was just like along the way, there's just like so many, obstacles that you might encounter. And of course, like you're also trying to like think about like what other people say. And even back then, like so many of so many of the people that were around me were just like, what are you thinking? Like, I mean, to be quite honest, like even my parents, right? Like even when I was in, college, my parents, many of my friends, even like some of my Korean and Korean American classmates were like, why are you like so interested in like Korean culture, like, and I remember like, like we would like, there was like a group of, Korean American students who like lobbied the administration to, hopefully get them to launch more like Korean related classes, like whether it's like classes on Korean history, culture, etc. And there just wasn't interest because like it felt like almost nobody thought of Korea, like South Korea, as being an important country at the time. And then like even when I was in grad school between like 2009 and 2011, I mean, I actually focused on Korean studies in grad school. I went to I studied international relations in grad school, and I concentrated in Korea studies. And even when I was in grad school, like most of the professors and even my classmates including my Korean classmates, were interested in like North Korea. They're just like, you know, it was like, who cares about, you know, Korean culture? Like no one took it seriously. And so for a very long time, I always felt like I was kind of like the odd person out. I was like crazy for wanting to do this. But then like by then, like, you know, by the time I was in grad school, like I knew that this was something that I wanted to do, even though like almost everyone I ran into like just thought I was being crazy and stupid and foolish. But you know, it's like you can't always control the timing, but like I think, you know, if you know what you're passionate about, you listen to your inner voice and you just take risks and try to make it happen. Like I think eventually it will happen.
And you have to believe in yourself, because there will be people that doubt you, or there will people who tell you not to do it. I was speaking to Becky White this week, and she does the Harfi project where she speaks to people of mixed, and she said the same thing. Everyone was telling her, what are you doing? Don't do that. And that always happens no matter what you're doing. You have to push through that sometimes, I think.
Yep, exactly.
And everybody loves,
and now can just be like, haha, like I told you so. And I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
It doesn't always work like that, but I agree about North Korea, by the way. So many of my undergrads, when we do Korean studies, they're fascinated by North Korea, because I think they see it as a puzzle or a problem that they can solve, or there's something that they're gonna, it's very appealing to people to study in that way, often more so than South Korea, which is even more of a conundrum, I think.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
Regina, let's call it an end here, I think. How about that? So
yeah, sounds good.
Relax.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, thank you. I loved listening to you. I think I learned a lot. So thank you for being so candid. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing your time, most importantly. I think that's, it's a big commitment. So thank you for doing that. I appreciate it.